Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 7, Lesson 4, Gitbash Commands. In this lesson, we'll demonstrate Gitbash installation, and then we'll define and demonstrate using some common Gitbash commands. Then we'll describe Git LFS and demonstrate implementation. First, let's download and install Gitbash. Now, if you already have GitHub Desktop, this may have already been done, but if not, it's a pretty quick installation. You can go to git-scm.com/downloads, and there's a command here that you can run in your command prompt, and that will install the latest version of Git and will also make any updates. If you get an error that says Git is not a recognized command, you may need to download Git. In that case, go to one of these downloads, Windows, Mac, or Linux, depending on what operating system you use, and just do the download and install that file. If you're interested in learning more about how Git works outside of GitHub Desktop or outside of these lessons, this git-scm.com website is a great resource. There's tons of documentation and information on here. As well, you can go to this GUI clients page and it shows you a list of all of the different UIs that you can use. You can see that GitHub Desktop is up here at the top, which is the one we're using, but there's quite a few other ones if you want to try a few different ones and see which one you like best. Once you have this downloaded though, we can go to one of our projects, and in this case, I've gone to our bug squash project that we set up in week 2, and if you right click, there will be an option that didn't currently exist that says Git Bash here, and you can select that and it will open a new command prompt window. And you'll notice that we are in the project file for bug squash. So let's talk through some of the commands that we could use in Git Bash. The first one we'll talk about is git help. Now, if you're not sure what to type, this is actually a really good command to start with. It gives you a list of some of the commands you can choose from. And you'll notice that a lot of these are very similar to the ones that we're using in GitHub Desktop. And that's because really what GitHub Desktop does is it's just a program that's sending these Git commands for you. But in some cases, there are actually things that you can't do through GitHub Desktop, and you could do them through this Git Bash command prompt. For instance, in bug squash, this is not currently a repository that we have set up. So we could use the git init and then the repository name, and this will set up a new repository for us. And now back in our GitHub Desktop, if we go and we add and say add existing repository, we can navigate to our bug squash and say add repository, and now all of those files are there. So this is an alternative to the way we did it in lesson 2, where we created the repository and then dragged the files in. This will just allow you to create the repository of a project that already exists. Git clone will allow us to clone a repository. So in GitHub Desktop, we had this add button and then clone, and then we would find the repository here. We could do that directly through Gitbash. And similarly, we can clone based upon a certain branch as well. Git fetch will fetch all the changes. And this is similar to this button here in GitHub Desktop. And to demonstrate this, I've opened the ball maze game repository that we set up in the last lesson. And if I type git fetch, it'll fetch all of the changes. And because there were none, it just returns nothing. But if there was a change, we would see the status of that fetch. The next command is git checkout and then the branch name, and this will allow you to switch between branches. So here I am in the main menu branch, and if I type git checkout and then main, it will switch me to the main branch, and we can see that here. Likewise, we can type git checkout and then -b in a new branch name, and that'll create a new branch. And we can see that it gave me a response switch to new branch test, and now my branch is test. And if we go to GitHub Desktop, we could see that we're now in the test branch as well. The next one is git commit and then -m, and then we want to put a commit message. And this is that summary that's down here in the bottom. So here in my bug squash, we had all of those changes when we created the new repository, and we can do that commit here but we could also do it through Gitbash. But I just want to remind you that when we set up a repository the other way, we set up that git ignore file, which means we're going to tell it to ignore certain files because we know that this is an Unreal Engine project. So if you want, you can just take the git ignore from Ball Maze Game and copy it and then paste it into Bug Squash. And now we have that in our Bug Squash game. And there's one more command we need to do a commit, and that is git add, and then we need to specify what files we want to add to this commit. And if we just press period, it will just say add all. And once that's done, we'll do git commit with your message. And we'll get a list of all the changes that were committed. And if we go back to our GitHub desktop, we'll also notice that all those files have been removed from the changes over here. And we can see our git commit message is down at the bottom, added project files. And the last one is to do git push. And we can see that because I hadn't set up my remote repository yet, it gave me a little hint. It told me that we need to set up the remote, and it gave me the command that we could use for that. And then it told me to git push using the remote name. So you could do that here. What I've done is just done it through GitHub desktop, and we could see that it's pushing those files to the remote now. And the last thing I want to discuss is Git LFS. And what LFS is large file storage. Now Git is traditionally used for sending text files and is not as commonly used for large files like those you create in game development. For instance, texture files or FBX files or any other large assets that we've used in some of our projects. So far this week, we've created repositories for weeks 1 and 2, but if we were to try to do this for our haunted house project, we may come across an error because we use some assets in those projects that were pretty large. So in this case, we need to actually use something called Git LFS. So I'm going to create a new repository, and it's going to be called Haunted House. And I'll do the same thing we did before. I'm going to copy all of these files into here. And now we can see that those files have been added. But if we were to try to do a commit right now, we would get an error. And that's because some of these files are above the file size that's allowed by Git. So for this, we're going to want to use LFS. And this is pretty simple. We'll go to our haunted house. We'll open a Gitbash for our haunted house. And we're going to type Git LFS install. And we'll see that it told us that the Git LFS is initialized. But now we need to tell Git LFS what files to include as part of the LFS system. And for this, we'll use the command git LFS track, and then the file type that we want to include. And everything, once it's in Unreal Engine, becomes a U asset. So we can type star to include all.u asset, and all of this should be in quotation marks. And then when we press enter, it'll say tracking U asset. And we can see this in the Git attributes that has been created in our repository, that it says U asset is filter LFS, diff LFS, merge LFS, which means all of our U asset files are now going to be included when we do a commit. So now when we commit our project files, we shouldn't get any errors. And we can push this, and now we could see that all of the files from our haunted house project are online. So now we could start sharing this with other teammates. That pretty much wraps up the source control section of this course. Now, we barely scratched the surface when it comes to source control, and there's plenty more that you could learn. I'll put some resources in the description of this video so you can do some additional research. And if you really want to dig in, I highly recommend Stephen Ulibarri's course on source control that's available on Udemy, and I'll put the link for that as well. For the rest of this week, we're going to continue developing our Space Fighter project though, and we'll dig into that in the next lesson. But at this time, what I would recommend is to get some practice using source control. So using the various methods that I've shown in the last few lessons, my recommendation is to make a repository for all 4 of the projects that we've created in this course. And that will give you some practice with setting up various things using GitHub. And if you like, you can even test your skills by trying to use a different service or a different client as well. In the next lesson, we're going to return to our Spacefighter project, and we're going to continue development on that for the rest of this week. So I'll see you in the next lesson.